Hello, everyone. This is Admiral Jamie Foggo from the Center for Maritime Strategy at the Navy League of the United States, just outside Washington, D.C. You're listening to Maritime Nation, where we take a deep dive into the challenges facing America's sea services and the role of the United States as a sea power on the global stage. This season is produced with support from Data Miner is recognized as one of the world's leading AI businesses. The company's clients are the first to know about high-impact events and emerging risks so they can mitigate and manage crises more effectively. Data miner solutions are relied on 24/7 by hundreds of clients in over 100 countries across 6 continents to help them solve real-world problems. While in uniform, I relied on Data Miner First Alert for situational awareness within the ever-expanding publicly available information space. Now, today, I'm delighted to be joined by my colleague, Dr. Salvatore Sal Mercogliano. Welcome, Sal.
Thanks for having me, Admiral.
Absolutely. Dr. Mercogliano is an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina, an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. He holds a Bachelor of Science in Marine Transportation from the State University of New York Maritime College, along with a Merchant Marine Deck Officer license, unlimited tonnage second mate, a Master's in Maritime History and Nautical Archaeology from East Carolina University, and a PhD in Military and Naval History from the University of Alabama. Sal is also the host of What's Going On with Shipping, otherwise known as What the Ship, which you can watch on YouTube and is linked in the show notes. Now, I watched the 103rd edition of What the Ship on Friday, and Sal, you were just full of incredible information about commercial maritime and some of the crises that are on the horizon for this nation today. So we welcome you to the Maritime Nation. And before we get started with the questions, Sal, we kick off each episode of Maritime Nation with a featured term from the Naval Terms Dictionary. I'll hold this up for our audience. This is my 1977 plebe issue Naval Terms Dictionary. I had to memorize that thing when I was at the Naval Academy. For this episode, our term is demurrage. A demurrage is a charge made when a merchant ship is delayed while loading or discharging cargo. And we're going to touch on this later in the episode on some delays faced by cargo ships in the last few years, many of which have made the headlines. So let's dive in. Sal, over the last few years, shipping has broken into the mainstream national security conversation. And that's a good thing. During the peak of the pandemic, the American public became more acutely aware of the vulnerability of supply chain security. In 2021, we witnessed the scene of the Ever Given grounding and obstructing the Suez Canal. It cost billions of dollars. We're 8 months into Houthi attacks on commercial vessels in the Red Sea. And just last March, the collapse of the Baltimore Bridge, the Francis Scott Key Bridge, highlighted the vulnerability of shipping infrastructure in this country. Now, this morning, I was reading a foreign policy article entitled The U.S. Navy Can't Build Ships. Decades of deindustrialization and downsizing have left America without shipyards to build and maintain a fleet. There's a quote in here I want to read from the U.S. Office of Naval Intelligence that estimates that China now has 232 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. I say again, China has 232 times the shipbuilding capacity of the United States. China built almost half the world's new ships in 2022, whereas U.S. shipyards produced just 0.13%. And we're going to talk about that. So, Sal, I think we have the people's attention, but what more does the national security community need to understand that global shipping and trade is important and in crisis? Over to you, sir.
Well, Admiral, I think you summarized it excellently. I mean, I think one of the things we've seen, and ever since Ever Given, when I really got started with my YouTube channel, has really captivated people's attention. They've realized what something that we know as military professionals and military analysts have known for a long time, that logistics makes everything work. Whether it's commercial, it's military, it's the same. It doesn't really matter whether you're hauling tanks or you're hauling Toyota trucks. It is the same thing. We need to make sure that we're able to move goods freely and easily on the world's oceans. And that's been the advantage we've had during the Cold War years. One of the things that we were able to do is ensure that the blue ocean was open to everyone. There was no real threat that we saw. We were able to contain it as part of our strategy for the Cold War was containment. Keep the Soviets contained, keep communism contained. It was really the goal. And thanks to new technologies and new business practices, we saw shipping increase exponentially. I think, post World War II in 1950, we hauled 500 million tons of cargo on the world's oceans. Last year, 2023, we moved 12 billion tons of cargo on the world's oceans. That has been a benefit for everybody. I mean, we've seen the world's prosperity increase about that. But now, post Cold War, we saw a change to take place. Some people want to talk about Cold War 2.0, but what makes this Cold War maybe different than the last one is our economies are integrated. Ours with China, ours with a lot of who we view as our peer competitor. And so what we're starting to see is the return to great power competition on the world seas. We're seeing contested seas. We're seeing the Houthi in action. We're seeing it on the Black Sea, in the Baltic, in the South China Sea. And that is changing the way we do business on the world's oceans. And my perspective, and one of the things I like to talk about a lot, is how we move goods on the world's oceans and what does this mean for world economies and for the world's militaries. We have seen the increase in the bulk trade, the movement of grain and ore around the planet. We've seen the movement of oil, both refined and unrefined, including liquefied natural gas, liquefied petroleum gas. Containerization, which is one of the greatest boons to world civilization, has really made us move goods in a way that we were never able to move goods efficiently before. And it's all thanks to a North Carolina truck driver by the name of Malcolm McLean, who came up with this idea of intermodalism. And he couldn't get this sold to the commercial industry at all. The one he sold it to eventually was the U.S. military for the Vietnam War. And it took the Vietnam War, of all things, to convince everyone that we needed to change the way we move goods on the world surface. And now we have the public attention. I think one of the things we need to be looking at in the national maritime and military industrial complexes and all the advocacy groups out there is how do we educate people on the role that shipping plays? We have been excellent at doing it in regards to the U.S. Navy. There's no question that people understand what the role of the U.S. Navy does in protecting the freedom of the seas. What we haven't done a great job in doing is really discussing is how essential the seas are to our prosperity and our commerce. And I think one of the things we have seen happen here is the attention has been drawn by people, not just in the seaside communities, in the shipbuilding towns. When you get two congressmen, two members of Congress to push through the first piece of legislation that looks at ocean shipping, one of them is from California, a Democrat, but the other one is a Republican from South Dakota, Dusty Johnson. That kind of tells you that, okay, there's a tension here. If a Republican from South Dakota realizes ocean shipping is important to me because I have to get my crops to market and I need ocean shipping to do it, that gives you the indication that there is a lot of attention being drawn to this. And I think it really falls on us, along with many other organizations, including the Navy League, for example, to really advocate for this. We've been excellent at talking about the role of the Navy in terms of power projection, but now we need to get to that mission that we just see unveiling right now in the Red Sea, and that is commerce protection and how vital it is to be able to defend shipping on the world's oceans and ensure that goods can move unfettered around the world.
Sal, I couldn't agree with you more. I want to touch on a couple of points that you brought up because I'm passionate about this as you are. So you mentioned the blue ocean. I grew up during the Cold War as a plebe in 1977, graduated in 81, smack dab in the middle of the Cold War, submariner. As soon as we left port, we shut the hatch. We were ready for war. But our goal was to keep the global commons open. And that has become increasingly more difficult in those 43 years, since I left the Naval Academy. You talked about 12 billion tons of commerce transiting on the ocean. Like over 90% of our commerce goes by the sea. That's why sea power is so important. That's why we created the Center for Maritime Strategy. And nowadays there are, nefarious actors out there, some non-state actors, piracy, but some state actors like China. who are causing problems in places in the South China Sea. Second Thomas Shoal, we're reading a lot about that. So I agree with you. This is really a Cold War 2.0, and it makes it more difficult because our economies are so linked. I mean, China owns about $1.7 trillion of our debt in treasury bonds. And so you can imagine the impact on them and the impact on us if there's a conflict over the South China Sea or the Straits of Taiwan. China also does business differently. I know you'll probably talk about this, but 5,600 China open ocean shipping carriers, Costco being one of them, heavily subsidized by the Chinese government. Not so in this country, which is probably why we only have 180 or so U.S. flagged ships. You mentioned the congressman, and I want to talk a little bit about that. But before I go there, the Navy League has woken up to this through our contacts with people like you, John McCowan, who's brilliant and a non-resident fellow, and John Conrad, the G captain, who helps us out both at Sea Air Space and also, with a lot of the publications and things we do here. So we have decided to put together an edited volume on commercial shipping, and you're helping us out with that. We hope to have that to the publisher here this summer, and we hope to do a book launch later in the summer or the fall and capture the attention of those folks in the Navy League who may not realize it's not just gray hull shipping that is a problem and keeping our fleet greater than 300 or up to 355 ships. It's also the beans and the bullets that have to get to the fight through our logistics and supply chain. So I've got a copy of a report in front of me, and recently a bipartisan and bicameral group of legislators, you talked about two congressmen. We got two congressmen and two senators here who unveiled a plan for national maritime strategy addressing infrastructure, commercial shipping, port security, and readiness, amongst other adjacent issues. So this is the report for those of our viewers that can see this on YouTube. It's entitled Congressional Guidance for a National Maritime Strategy, and it is signed out by Congressman Mike Waltz, Senator Mark Kelly, Senator Marco Rubio, and Congressman John Garamendi, who's probably the Democrat you were talking about from California and is a great friend of the center. Senator Kelly actually came here for our end-of-year event in 2023. We've done it twice. We're going to do it again in 2024. It's called America's Future Fleet. It's a day-long seminar. It's after the Reagan Defense Forum in California, so we do this on the East Coast. And he announced here on December 5th the drafting of legislation for the U.S. Merchant Marine to play a greater role in the conflict with China. And as an astronaut, both he and his brother are graduates of maritime academies. And I think that led to this letter and his collaboration with Congressman Waltz and Garamendi and Senator Rubio when he put this kind of warning order out. So from your vantage point, Sal, is there a need for a strategy, and what should one contain and prioritize? What do you recommend as this moves forward? This is just a start. Now we're going to get into the nitty gritty. We're going to roll up our sleeves and get our fingernails dirty in deciding how to move forward. So blank slate, over to you, sir.
Well, let me first say Mark Kelly inherits that seat there by John McCain. I think he's a great advocate now for the Merchant Marine, being a graduate of the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. I actually went to school with his brother Scott over at New York Maritime. He was my indoctrination officer, so I know the Kellys pretty well. I think, one of the things I talk about a lot is this creation of a new national maritime strategy. And what we're getting right now is really a renaissance, I would argue, in almost strategies. We're seeing a lot of discussion and talk on it right now. And I always go back to 1920, to the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which is known as the Jones Act. And a lot of people have images about the Jones Act. But let me be clear about what Senator Wesley Jones from Washington, along with several other key individuals, including the Chief of Naval Operations, William S. Benson, who became the head of the U.S. Shipping Board in 1920. Both Jones and Benson realized we needed to kind of codify a lot of the issues that came out of the First World War. We found ourselves in a position kind of akin to where we are today, where we were utterly dependent on foreign shipping to move our international goods. And we found ourselves in a peer-to-peer conflict where we lacked the means to be able to support and sustain our military overseas. And so what came out of that was the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, which I would argue is our first peacetime national maritime strategy. It was an all-encompassing document. It didn't just involve coastal shipping. There were international rate setting. There was a shipbuilding program. It established the U.S. Shipping Board as a permanent entity. It did everything you needed for shipping. It really created some federal oversight, but worked with the commercial industry too. And that was because we found ourselves really at the mercy of the world when it came to being able to not just execute our military mission, but to fund our government and actually move our economy. When 1914 rolled around, cotton piled up on our docks and we had an economic recession. So in many ways, I think a maritime strategy is absolutely essential for the United States because we find ourselves in a very similar position today, where a lot of our shipping, almost 98% of our international shipping, is handled by ships outside the United States. And again, it doesn't take much. One of the things we should have learned over the past 3-4 years here is that little events have the impact on global shipping that is disproportionate maybe to their size. They can really, almost have that butterfly effect. If tomorrow Chairman Xi really wants to influence the United States, he tells the ships of the Chinese Overseas Shipping Company, which make up 15% of the world's ocean fleet, to slow down by a day or two. And that causes economic chaos across the board. It will slow up cargo. It will create that demurrage you talked about at the very beginning there, where all of a sudden there are millions, if not billions of dollars of fees that happen. We saw that happen in Baltimore. What happens when one ship shuts down one port? It has a catastrophic effect. It has a cumulative effect. And so the reason you want a maritime strategy, and again, we've had a lot of naval strategies. We've had great strategies put out by the Navy and the Marine Corps and even the Coast Guard. But what has been lacking recently is really the commercial aspect. How do we encompass a commercial aspect into that? It is impossible for the U.S. to carry 100% of its foreign commerce. That's never going to happen. It was never even prophesized in any of the early documentation. But one of the things we really want to be able to do is make sure we're not 100% dependent on foreign. And I think that is the goal we need to set. We need to set achievable goals right now. For example, we have 50 tankers in the U.S. commercial fleet that are going to be aging out. They were built as a result of the Oil Pollution Act of 1990 after Exxon Valdez, double hull tankers built in the 1990s, early 2000s. They're reaching 20, 30 years out. We're going to need to replace 50 tankers here in the near future. Wow. That should be a key element that's incorporated into any maritime strategy, because those tankers not just provide oil and fuel for the domestic United States, but can be used to supplement Navy oilers in time of war, something that happened exactly in both World War I and World War II, where we took commercial tankers and put them in a role of supply oilers and supply tankers. So again, one of the things we need to be looking at is something like that. The Great Lakes fleet needs to be recapitalized. That's a commercial entity. It brings work to Fincantieri up in Wisconsin, but it also ensures that we're moving key products for the U.S. economy, for example, so that we make sure that our industry doesn't come to a grinding halt. And again, I think what we need to do is kind of take a step back and really understand that the problem we have is a lot in government, military, and even in the common public don't understand the maritime sector. I talk to people in the maritime sector a lot who don't understand other sectors of the maritime. One of my advantages is I get to kind of look back 50,000 foot and give this perspective where I can kind of suck in the entire maritime industry and kind of convey exactly what it means, so that when you see pressure points, when all of a sudden you see one sector having an issue, you can understand how it impacts other sectors across the board.
Sal, thanks very much. And first of all, I want to just recapture a couple of those points. And also, I appreciate you bringing up the Maritime Act of 1920, the Jones Act, Senator Jones, and the fact that the CNO, Admiral Benson, was involved in that. And I laud that. And I think our uniformed Navy leaders need to be more involved in this discussion and the solutions for commercial shipping, because it's going to affect us in the event of a war. And that's probably what you said about the Jones Act. The Navy League is fully behind the Jones Act. We support it. And another one of our sponsors, the Transportation Institute, will love the fact that you mentioned it here on Maritime Nation. It's music to their ears. Um, Really important what you said about China Ocean Shipping Company. And in a grand strategy for China, if they really wanted to impact world trade, they have these levers. And as you said, 15% of the shipping moving on the oceans today, just slow it down. And look what happens with the demurrage. Uh, China has incredible levers of power. Um, we can't be 100% dependent on foreign shipping. And the tankers you mentioned, I've done some work with Military Sealift Command and my friend, now retired Mike Wetlaufer, in some of his gaming down in Tidewater area, Virginia, concerning console ships and taking some of these commercial tankers and using them to transfer petroleum oil and lubricants to other ships, auxiliary ships that can now go to Navy ships. That's really, really important. And if you look, as we roll into our next question about automation, if you look what happened in the port of Los Angeles 2 years ago during Christmas time, I mean, we were just chock-a-block. We couldn't move cargo onto ships. Costco was coming in, they were dumping their cargo, and then they weren't waiting for us to load American goods to go back to Asia. They just took off and went and reloaded. By the time they got back, we were still stifled. So you look at LA versus Shanghai, and it pales in comparison to some of the systems, the cranes, the automation that they have in China. And we really need to get with the program in our own port facilities. And we'll talk a little bit about intermodalism later. But this brings me to the rise of automation everywhere, which has included calls for uncrewed cargo ships. The Navy is experimenting with uncrewed fleets right now. We've gone across the vast Pacific Ocean with uncrewed systems. Are uncrewed ships or systems, including cranes, pier infrastructure, container storage facilities, and the like, of value to the commercial industry? And can we catch up with China in this regard? Over to you, Sal.
Yeah, I'll talk about it from two sides. One, on the shipboard side. So three of our best allies, Norway, Korea, and Japan, are really full bore in the issue of automation at sea. We're actually seeing fully autonomous vessels operating. In Norway, we're seeing a autonomous coastal container ship that's electrically powered, operating between ports. In Japan and Korea, we're seeing much more automation being implemented. Now, automation at sea is always a kind of a dicey issue because of a couple of issues. One of the most important is one that's overarching the maritime industry right now is cybersecurity, is the issue of potential threats of attacks. One of the worst cyber attacks that ever happened was to the maritime sector, Maersk, in 2017, which shut down Maersk's operations for a week. They got infected with the NotPetya virus. This was an offshoot out of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, and it shut down their entire operations. Fortunately, there were other carriers that could have picked up the slack, but it cost Maersk millions of dollars in that. There's a big push toward automation. A lot of the things that we've been seeing will help maybe prevent accidents like Ever Given or potentially Dolly in Baltimore. At the same time, there's a concern about going too far in automation in that you remove the human element from it. I think in terms of U.S. flag vessels, one of the things that's being pushed right now is really reducing our crew levels to be comparable to the foreign level. We have too many crew members on board. And during a period of time when labor is at a shortage, this may not be a bad element. We are seeing automation being done on the coastal level. And I think that's one of the areas where you'll see it much more. I think one of the issues, too, is assistance in maneuvering and control of vessels. Stop relying just 100% on human control and put some automation in there to protect them. So I think the industry is doing it. You have an issue with the cyber, but you also have an issue with insurance, too. I'm one of those believers who thinks you're not going to see a fully autonomous unmanned vessel sailing across the Atlantic or the Pacific because you're never going to be able to insure a $500 million ship and hope it shows up on the other side. But I do think you'll see it in many other areas. And more importantly, we'll see uncrewed engine rooms, reduced manning on vessels. That's really key. The other element that you see is in the ports. And one of the things that the U.S. consistently gets hit on is the poor kind of running of our ports. In other words, our U.S. ports tend to be slower than foreign ports. And that's not because of the stevedores or the labor or workers. Let's be clear about that. We can offload a container off a ship as fast as anybody else can. Where the delay comes in is that handover of cargo from the ship to the consumer, to the shipper. And we see some examples of really innovative ports. If you go to Long Beach, for example, the LBCT terminal, the Long Beach Container Terminal, is an extremely efficient terminal. It moves cargo twice as fast as neighboring terminals do. And that didn't see a massive reduction in the number of personnel working there. It just changed what the jobs were and where we're automating so that when truck drivers come in to get their containers, they're doing it without paper. They're doing it with basically apps on their phone. They can book, they can come in, they can move things much more efficiently. A lot of the people that you see being removed from the yards are doing jobs that are no longer needed, but they still need personnel for the data and the transport. So we have to start investing in the ports. Our problem in the United States is that ports are run at a local and municipal level. There's really no big oversight of ports. In most countries around the world, ports are national assets, not in the United States. So you get the Port of Long Beach, it's run by the city of Long Beach. Go to Savannah, it's run by Georgia Ports. What we need is an entity like the Maritime Administration, like the Department of Transportation to come in and do more to help coordinate an overall port strategy. What do we want our ports to do? A lot of highlights coming out of the fact that Dolly hit the bridge coming out of Baltimore. Who is looking at our port development in holistic way, not just at the terminals, not just at a state and local level, but really overall, who's looking at that? And I think if we can improve our ports, make our ports really the model for other ports around the world, that entices business. It makes us more efficient. And more importantly, when you have events like what happened in 2021 off of LA and Long Beach, you know, we didn't have a shortage of shipping. Had plenty of ships. There were 109 ships off LA and Long Beach. We were not short of ships. Where we had the problem was processing the cargo ashore. And that's really infrastructure, it's information, it's technology, and it's really enticing some really smart people in the United States to go into that industry. You know, one of the things when we talk about the maritime industry, people tend to think, well, I don't want to go to sea. It's like, well, no, there are plenty of jobs ashore that are tied into the maritime industry. And one of them is those freight forwarders, it's that shipping experts, it's the data collectors. We have to get better at doing that. Where you see countries that are very efficient at doing that, Rotterdam in the Netherlands, Shanghai in China, that's what they're using. They're merging technology and information to make the movement of cargo much more efficient.
Outstanding feedback. Thank you very much. And merging technology and information, we can do that. And we've got the smart people, we've got the open architectures, and we have the ability to innovate. I want to foot stomp a couple of points you brought up, one on reduced manning at sea. You know, I've been told, hey, we can build a lot more commercial vessels if we put our mind to it, or we can purchase vessels and bring them in under a U.S. flag, which raises some legalistic kind of concerns on Buy American. But we probably don't have enough mariners to man those ships. So that's a problem. So reduce manning in engine rooms and throughout other places on the ship or ashore is something to be looking at in this port strategy or this maritime strategy. I loved what you said about having a national port strategy to stitch together all these different entities that are responsible for our infrastructure along the coast. And particularly with regard to what you said about LA. And again, we'll talk about some ways to alleviate that kind of problem in the future, not on this next question, but the one following on intermodalism. Last week, my friend Courtney Cubey of NBC reported that the U.S. has successfully towed a floating dock system for the delivery of critical humanitarian aid to the shores of the Gaza Strip. It's actually moving trucks from the sea with humanitarian aid to help feed or alleviate some of the famine for those refugees in Gaza. Now, in the Navy, we call this system connectors, and depends on a lot of things. It depends on weather. It depends on having a beach that allows you to get in there and to land and to extend from the beach out to the sea where the ships can come alongside and move their cargo to that floating pier. And it also depends on having a permissive, non-hostile environment. So what we have done is establish this connector ashore in Gaza in what I would call a potentially non-permissive, and it could be a hostile environment. Been some threats, been some mortars launched at the beach site in the last month or so before they actually got going. So I laud the United States of America for its courage in enabling us to do this. It's a high-risk operation, but it's one that showcases the value of shore connectors, or this intermodalism, as I discussed it. And that's been highlighted by our friend, Brent Sadler, over at the Heritage Foundation. But as you pointed out earlier, the originator of this thought was truck driver Malcolm McLean. So we're going to write about this in our edited volume on commercial maritime. We've got some pieces in there on intermodalism. But I would ask, based on this example, which everybody is seeing, oh, by the way, the Navy likes to do distributed maritime operations and the Marines like to do expeditionary advanced base operations. And we're going to rely on connectors to make that work for us in some of the smaller island chains in the Pacific. So from a commercial maritime standpoint, how do you assess the logistics of this move? What does it show in terms of U.S. capability? And does it help us with the future of logistics and commercial maritime? Over to you.
Well, I think the 7th Transportation and the U.S. Navy amphibious group have done a fantastic job in putting together this joint logistics over the shore operation. However, one of the things it does highlight is the poor state, I would argue, of our Sealift capability right now. I'm looking right over your shoulder at a big Trident, and for a long time, the thing we had was what was called the Sealift Trident. It was 3 prongs. It was the afloat prepositioning, it was surge Sealift, and it was sustainment Sealift. And all 3 of those are at a critical state, I would argue, right now. Afloat prepositioning, we have gone from having 3 Marine Corps squadrons stationed with a brigade's worth of equipment apiece down to just a half of one in Diego Garcia, another half in the Western Pacific. The Army is talking about getting rid of their entire afloat prepositioning squadron. One of the things we used to be able to do was put together a Trident Pier and a joint logistics over the shore operation in a very short period of time, because we had that material either afloat, either on an Army port opening package on vessels, or stationed in Japan or the UK. Well, we got rid of that. We phased that out. And what that means is, as we lose our afloat prepositioning capability, that means it's going to take longer to respond. It took 2 months to really put everything together for a JLOTS over the beach in Gaza. You and I both know that the Atlantic is a pond compared to the Pacific, and that's a much tougher nut to crack. When you look at surge Sealift, this is those ships that we keep in a reserve status along the U.S. East, Gulf, and West Coast. Those ships are on average 45 years old. And, there's a big question whether or not they're going to be ready to go when the call comes. They're supposed to be at an 85% readiness. Back in 2019, we did a test. We came up about 40%. The readiness has increased a bit. We've started to see a vessel replacement program in there, but it's been slow. And this is the key tonnage that's going to move the Army, the Marine Corps, and the Air Force overseas to a combatant commander. They rely on this. And I have a question whether or not those ships are ready. And then the sustainment portion comes from the commercial U.S. Merchant Marine. And the U.S. Merchant Marine is a decline. We went from being the #1 Merchant Marine post-World War II to the number 21 Merchant Marine in the world today. And that's not just a shortage in vessels, it's a shortage in mariners, because those same mariners have to crew that MSC fleet. They have to crew the prepositioning fleet. They have to crew the surge fleet. And there are big concerns I have over it. Right now, one of the statistics not commonly known is there's about 1/3 of a million sailors in the U.S. Navy. But 1 out of 5 ships in the U.S. Navy have civilian merchant mariner crews on it. This is the MSC ships. These are the underway replenishment oilers. Those ships have a grand total of 6,000 mariners. 6,000 mariners crew 1/5 of the Navy's fleet. Yet there's 5,000 billets, which means we don't have enough mariners. We need to hire about 4,000 more mariners. MSC needs about 10,000 merchant mariners. You need about 2 mariners for every position. And we find ourselves in this really critical shortfall right now. We have never experienced a point in our history where our logistics could not keep up with our military capability. And one of the concerns I have is we may be approaching that point. And that is something you can't be built overnight. And so when we look at our Sealift capability and we look at what happened with just the deployment of the JLOTS facility to Gaza, we had one of the Army watercraft broke down. We had one of the MSC ships experience an engine problem. We had weather diversions. It took a long time to do that. And that's going to be the issue we may see in a potential scenario where we have to go in a peer-to-peer struggle, maybe across the Pacific or across the Atlantic.
Wow. Great answer again. And, JLOTs and connectors, really, really important. I can remember when I first became a flag officer, as a flag officer for 10, 11 years, we had the pre-post ships in the Mediterranean theater. We used to move them around. We'd put them in safe havens for weather. They were out there to do things like reforger, return of forces to Germany, operating up in Norway. And when I did Trident Juncture, we didn't have those afloat pre-post ships, so we had to base our pre-po equipment on the land. Now, it worked, but it doesn't work everywhere. And so it was nice to have that capability, but we were penny wise and pound foolish. For a few $1 million, we got rid of those ships, and now we don't have that capability to deliver the kind of connector in Gaza, like you said, in a very rapid or efficient manner. I also agree with you. I used to hear from my friends in the Pacific all the time, hey, Foggo, don't talk to us about challenges in the Atlantic theater or across the transatlantic bridge. It's a pond. Why don't you come out and spend some time in a real ocean in the Western Pacific? And they're absolutely right. The tyranny of distance is something that really impacts our ability to operate. And I would add, from John Mearsheimer and from other books that have been quoted, that he's quoted in, the stopping power of water when we're talking about the Western Pacific. So MSC, Military Sealift Command, love those guys. They ran along with a U.S. Navy commanding officer, the USS Mount Whitney, my favorite ship in the United States Navy. Likewise, Blue Ridge out in the Pacific. Those two ships have the moniker USS, United States ships, but many of the Military Sealift Command ships are USNS, U.S. Naval Service. Depends on if they've got a commissioned commanding officer on board. And the USS Herschel Woody Williams has been doing some great work around Africa and is GIFMAP, Global Force Management, assigned to AFRICOM to help them maintain a U.S. presence on the continent. That brings me to our last question of the day. We've been going about 35 minutes here, Sal, so I'm going to let you wrap this up. And I want to read something that talks about this congressional guidance that we mentioned earlier for a national maritime strategy. The guidance recommends that Congress establish a presidentially appointed position to synchronize all national maritime affairs and policy and to oversee a new National Maritime Council on the model of the National Security Council or the National Economic Council. A National Maritime Advisor answering directly to the President and with the authority to coordinate maritime policymaking across the federal government would give maritime policy a permanent seat at the table in the White House and could go a long way alleviating the government's chronic sea blindness. So, a National Maritime Advisor. Imagine if you could be that National Maritime Advisor. And I want to go back to one of my favorite movies. We talked about it earlier before we started taping, and that is Gladiator with Russell Crowe. Supposedly coming out with Gladiator 2 in the next year. You remember, we've all seen it. I've seen it like 10 times. Saw it on the submarine when I was in command, over and over again because the guys loved it. In the last scene when Russell Crowe, call sign Maximus, kills the Emperor Commodus, and he was wounded before the fight, and Maximus is dying himself in the ring. The head of the Praetorian Guard, Quintus, and this guy is right out of Central Casting in Hollywood, leans over to Maximus and says, Maximus, pregnant pause, what are your orders? So, Sal, if you were that national maritime advisor, sir, what would your orders be to fix all these problems we've talked about today? Over to you.
Well, one of the things I'm kind of sucking up this role right here, so
Please do.
It's a great analogy. One of the things that I believe needs to be done, number one, is MARAD needs to be put on, and this is the Maritime Administration. This is the one area where we should have all our maritime interests centralized and localized. Should be at the same level, comparable to the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, the Rail Administration, the Road Administration. Right now, it doesn't. The Maritime Administration doesn't have the same power capabilities at all. I know when maritime administrators go before Congress, they're sometimes asked, what do you need? I would have a laundry list of issues I'd want to do because the mission of the Maritime Administration is to promote the U.S. Merchant Marine. And I think not having the same powers and oversights and capabilities as other agencies really hinders their ability to make issues. A couple of things right off the bat. I mean, if you create an advisor for that, one of the things I'd want to do is be able to really raise the level and attention of this issue. And I would harness the power of the Federal Merchant Marine Academy, the 6 state maritime academies, and use those faculty and those personnel there to do a great job in educating officials, local, municipal, national levels, and the public about the role of the U.S. Merchant Marine and why shipping is so important. The National Endowment of the Arts does a great program at Mystic Seaport on educating on the history of the U.S. maritime. We need to educate on what it does today and what it could do for us in the future. I do think that a lot of the proposals that are coming out right now from Congress and from other advocacy groups are great. You really need to bring together the stakeholders. One of the things I found most interesting in my studies is when the Merchant Marine Act of 1936 was passed. This was a landmark piece of legislation. It was a New Deal piece of legislation. It was intended to get the U.S. shipbuilding industry and the U.S. maritime sector up to speed so that if there was a second war, we wouldn't be behind the power curve like we were in World War I. And that's because of Franklin Roosevelt, who'd been Assistant Secretary of the Navy during the First World War. He saw it happen. And one of the things that act did was immediately put together an agency that did a survey of not just the U.S. Merchant Marine, but the global Merchant Marines, and really found out what was working, what wasn't working. Where do we need to be? Are there essential trade routes we need to be on? Are there essential ships that we need to start building? What do we need in case of a potential conflict, both in times of war and in peace? Where do we need to divert our resources? And they came up with, what became known as Title V and VI, which created these differential subsidies for both construction and operation. But you're in the middle of the Great Depression. Nobody had the money to build ships. And so Title VII allowed us to start building ships. The program was to build 50 ships every year for 10 years, 500 ships. This was going to be the bedrock of a new merchant marine. Those ships weren't going to be government operated, they would be government owned, but they'd be leased out to commercial firms. And what that did is by the time we got into the conflict, 37 of those first 50 ships were taken over by the military. These became troop ships. These became tenders. These became fast oilers. They also became cargo ships, moving key resources, bauxite up to the United States for construction and aluminum for aircraft. But they also put the shipyards back to work so that when SS America, the very first ship in this program, goes down the ways on August 31st of 1939, the day before Hitler invades Poland, the next ship on that building ways is USS Indiana, a battleship. And then when Indiana goes down the ways in 1940, USS Yorktown, the second Yorktown, CV-10 down in Charleston, is put up on the ways. So the shipping ways that build commercial ships transition seamlessly over to building military vessels. You don't get the Two Ocean Navy Act of 1940 without the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. And I think that's really the issue I would want to focus on more than anything else. If you go around the world today and you look at the 3 largest shipbuilding nations on the planet, it's China, it's South Korea, it's Japan. They build in their shipyards commercial vessels, and on top of that, they build naval vessels. In the US, it's the exact opposite. Our shipyards build naval vessels and maybe build a commercial ship here or there. We've got to get ourselves back into the game. And I firmly believe we can. I don't buy this argument that the US is starting too late. We're not going to be able to do it. In 1934, we built 2 merchant ships. In 1935, we built 2 merchant ships. In 1940, we built 50. By 1943, we built 1,600. We can ramp up if we want to. It's just a matter of really getting people behind it, educating people, and making this case that what you get out of a commercial merchant marine isn't just a batch of ships and subsidies and it costs you money. It actually creates revenue, it creates jobs, it creates opportunities, and most importantly, as it says in the preamble of both the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, 1936, and 1970, and every Merchant Marine Act since then, is that you create a merchant marine that can serve in peacetime and wartime as an auxiliary for the military, but also carry a good portion of our commerce. And I guess my role would be to try to educate and really implement that, to see ourselves back in a position where we're building more commercial ships, which in turn would help us build naval vessels and make us a power whereby we're not wholly dependent on foreign shipping and foreign shipbuilding for our commerce.
Sal, thank you very much. Spoken like a true maritime professional and the well-educated man that you are. You mentioned Franklin Roosevelt. Just outside this office, there's a bust of Teddy Roosevelt. And in 1902, he got together for a meeting with J.P. Morgan, the great investment banker of this country, up in New York, November of 1902 at the New York Yacht Club. Meeting was convened by the Naval Order, which still exists today. And they decided at the time that we needed a Navy League of the United States to advocate for sea power. That's how we came into fruition, over 120 years ago. And I'd like to thank you for being on our show today. And folks, that's a wrap. Appreciation goes out to Dr. Mercogliano for joining Maritime Nation. And Sal, if they do come up with this Maritime Advisory Council, I think you, as a minimum, need to be on the council. And, it would be really nice if you were that maritime advisor and provide that advice to government and directly to the president that you just gave our listeners. I'd like to thank our listeners for joining us each month. If you have not heard our previous episode, you can always catch up on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Episodes and all content described here today can be found on our website, www.centerformaritimestrategy.org, all lowercase. And thank you to Data Miner First Alert for the sponsorship and support, and our sound engineer, James Peterson, for helping us make all this happen. Stay tuned for the next episode of Maritime Nation.